June 1941. The air, which only yesterday smelled of blooming lilac and the dust of peaceful roads, suddenly grew heavy, thick with the scent of burning and iron. The sky, torn in two by the howl of diving bombers, came crashing down, and beneath its leaden dome, the familiar world shattered into a million fragile pieces. War burst into every home like an uninvited guest, its icy breath silencing the laughter of children and cutting off songs mid-verse. It was then, in the fiery chaos of those first days, at the recruitment office doors blackened by grief, that they appeared alongside the grim, silent men and beardless youths. They were yesterday's schoolgirls, with tight braids that still seemed to hold the ribbons from their recent graduation ball. University students who hid volumes of poetry beneath their simple cotton blouses. Factory workers whose hands were accustomed to the grease of machines, not the cold, merciless steel of a weapon. They stood in those endless lines, insistent, stubborn, their eyes burning with an inner resolve that war was transforming with terrifying speed from clear and naive to steel. They didn't ask. They demanded. They demanded to be sent where steel thundered and the earth was soaked in blood. The weary recruitment officers, their faces etched with wrinkles overnight, waved them away in confusion. "Go to the rear, girls. We need working hands there too. War is not a woman's job." But in response, they heard a defiant, almost challenging whisper. "We want to go to the front, as snipers." That word, falling from a young woman's lips, was a deafening dissonance in the funeral symphony of war. A sniper. Not a nurse, not a signal operator, a hunter. One who sees the enemy not as a blurry gray shape in the smoke of a general assault, but as a living, specific target in the crosshairs of a scope. It was a choice that peacetime logic could not explain. It was an instinctive impulse of the soul, engulfed by the fire of a shared catastrophe and personal grief. They chose the path of the ice-cold loner, the path of chilling, almost inhuman patience and of a single, decisive shot. They demanded a heavy rifle instead of textbooks, deadly optics instead of opera glasses. War ruthlessly stripped the blush of youth from their faces, leaving behind a pale mask of concentrated fury. They did not yet know of the endless hours waiting in frozen nests, the multi-day ambushes under a scorching sun, or the constant, unblinking gaze of an enemy shooter in return. They knew only one thing: their homeland was on fire, and they could not, they had no moral right to stand aside. And so, in the thunder and flames of 41, a new, unprecedented generation of warriors was born, young women with eyes of steel, ready to become a personal nightmare for those who had come to their land with a sword. The spring of 1942 near Moscow was cold and late, as if nature itself hesitated to awaken in a world consumed by fire. It was here, a few dozen kilometers from the capital, in the village of Veshnyaky, that a facility not marked on any map was hidden among age-old pine trees. This was no ordinary military unit. It was a harsh monastery dedicated to a new, cruel god, the god of war. Officially, it was the Central Women's Sniper Training School. Unofficially, in the smoke-filled back rooms of headquarters, and in the whispers of the cadets themselves, it was known as the Factory of Avenging Angels. Those same girls with eyes of steel flocked here from every corner of the vast country. Here, their romantic impulses, born from the smoke of patriotic films and the pages of heroic books, would be plunged into the icy font of ruthless discipline and forged in the crucible of an inhuman science, the science of killing. They were met not with flowers, but with the piercing gaze of stern commanders, men who had fought in the Winter War and at Khalkhin Gol, who knew everything about death, and then some. The first thing they tried to beat out of the girls was their illusions. "Forget the movies, girls," boomed the bass voice of the school's commander, Colonel Novikov. "A sniper isn't a pretty pose with a rifle. It's hard, dirty, grueling work. It's sweat, blood, and endless patience. 99% of your time is waiting, and 1% is a single shot, with no room for error." And so the transformation began. The factory operated without days off or holidays. The day started before dawn, with a multi-kilometer forced march in full gear. Then came hours of crawling on their bellies through mud, melting snow, and prickly stubble. They were taught to become invisible, to merge with the earth, to become a rock, a hummock, the shadow beneath a bush. Their bodies, which had once known only the lightness of dance steps, grew accustomed to the leaden weight of the Mosin Nagant rifle, which became an extension of their arms, their spines, their will. They studied the deadly arithmetic of ballistics, how to calculate a bullet's trajectory at 300, 500, 800 meters, how to adjust for wind, humidity, and a moving target. Their fingers, accustomed to embroidery or piano keys, learned the smooth, almost gentle squeeze of the trigger, a motion that had to become as natural as breathing. But the most terrifying test was not physical. It awaited them on the firing range. At first, it was just targets, but one morning, when they came to the line, they saw them. Full-sized plywood silhouettes with the crude outlines of enemy uniforms painted on them. And the instructor, articulating every word, gave the command. "Single target, to the head, fire." In that moment, something inside them broke. It was one thing to shoot at circles, and quite another to aim at something that simulated a person. One of the cadets, a young Siberian girl named Olya, lowered her rifle. Her hands, which had just been holding the heavy weapon with confidence, were trembling. "I can't," she whispered, looking at the instructor with tear-filled eyes. "He looks alive." The instructor, a young lieutenant with a burned face, walked right up to her. His voice was quiet, but all the more terrifying for it. "Alive? And the real one? The one who's aiming at your brother near Rzhev right now? What about him? When he pulls the trigger, will he think about your brother being alive? No. To him, he's a target. And while you're here shedding tears, he might have already fired. Remember this, soldier. That is not a person in front of you. It is a target. A piece of lead that must be stopped before it stops you or your comrades. Your pity is a bullet in the heart of a soldier in our army. Understood?" Olya silently nodded, wiped her tears with the dirty sleeve of her tunic, raised her rifle, and fired. The plywood head shattered into splinters. The factory had no room for sentiment. In parallel with combat training, another, no less important job was being done. These girls were to become not just effective soldiers. They were becoming symbols, perfect images honed under the ruthless floodlights of state propaganda. Correspondents from the Red Star newspaper and newsreel cameramen became frequent visitors to the school. The girls were taught not only how to shoot, but how to pose. A proudly raised chin, a cold, confident gaze, a faint smile on their lips. From the hundreds of faces, the most photogenic, the most expressive, were selected. Their stories, real and slightly embellished, were prepared for front-page articles. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Natalia Kovshova, Maria Polivanova. Their names were to thunder across the country, inspiring heroic deeds on the home front and striking terror into the enemy at the front line. They were not just cadets. They were living weapons of total war, striking not only with a bullet, but with their image, the image of a beautiful and merciless goddess of vengeance, stepping out from the pages of ancient epics onto the battlefields of the 20th century. The final exam was the quintessence of the entire course. It wasn't shooting at a range. It was a full-scale simulation of a combat mission. 2 days in the forest, in a nest they had dug and camouflaged themselves. They had to track down and notionally eliminate an enemy officer, an instructor who was, in turn, an expert hunter searching for them. It was a test of everything: endurance, cunning, and the ability to tolerate cold, hunger, and the call of nature without giving away their position with a single movement. Those who passed this hell received their sniper's logbook and their own personal zeroed-in rifle. It was a sacred ritual. In the silence of the snow-covered forest, standing in formation, Colonel Novikov presented each graduate with her rifle. It was like a medieval knighting ceremony. He wasn't just handing over a piece of metal and wood. He was entrusting them with fate, with the responsibility for dozens of lives, both enemy and friendly. And in that moment, they ceased to be Lyuba, Vera, or Katya. They became fighters, identified by the serial number of their weapon, which from now on was their only friend, protector, and executioner. The factory had graduated its first batch. The perfect, deadly angels of vengeance were ready. Ahead of them was a train, heading west, into the thundering, bloody inferno of the front. If fate were a book, then in the chapter dedicated to Lyudmila Pavlichenko, someone with a merciless hand had torn out the pages of her peaceful life and replaced them with scorched sheets smelling of gunpowder and blood. Before June of 1941, she was Lyuda, a fourth-year student at the history department of Kyiv University. A girl with intelligent, inquisitive eyes who studied the biography of Bohdan Khmelnytsky and dreamed of a scholarly career, of the quiet of archives and the rustle of ancient manuscripts. But she had one passion, one small trait atypical for a humanities student. She was an excellent shot. Since her youth, she had trained at an Oso Aviakim shooting club and could easily hit the bullseye from any position. She could never have imagined that this peaceful hobby, this ability to send a small piece of lead precisely to its target, would become her profession, her curse, and her immortality. When the war broke out, she didn't hesitate to appear at the recruitment office. At her request to be sent to the front, the recruiter just smirked. "Girl, you should be sewing and embroidering, not running around with a rifle." But Lyudmila's gaze was harder than steel. She silently handed him her Voroshilov sharpshooter badges. The recruiter was still skeptical, so they gave her an impromptu test. On a distant hill, 2 Romanian collaborators helping the enemy were spotted. "See them?" an officer asked. "Prove what you're capable of." Lyudmila silently took the rifle. 2 shots, almost merging into one, tore through the silence. 2 distant figures, which had just seemed indistinguishable from the landscape, collapsed to the ground. There were no more doubts. She was enlisted in the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division. And so, the history student began to write her own bloody thesis on the fields of battle. Her life at the front turned into a terrifying, monotonous ritual. The defense of Odessa, then the hellish battles for Sevastopol. She would go out on the hunt at dawn, when the fog, thick as milk, blanketed the earth, concealing her figure, and would return at dusk, having added a few more notches to her personal, ruthless count. She was not just a soldier. She was an artist of death, a master of camouflage and patience. She could lie in a hide for 18 hours, motionless, barely breathing, merging with the stones, the grass, the torn-up earth, becoming a ghost, a phantom with a telescopic sight for eyes. She studied the enemy's habits as meticulously as she had once studied historical documents. She knew when a German officer would step out for his morning coffee, when a signaler would reach to adjust an antenna, when a machine gunner would relax for a split second. And in that second, her rifle would speak its final, decisive word. But even this ice-cold angel of death had a heart. At the front, she met her love, a fellow sniper named Leonid Kitsenko. They became partners, one shadow for two, one breath. They covered each other, shared their last crust of bread and the short hours of quiet when they could simply be silent, looking at the stars in the rare gaps of the smoky sky. Their happiness was as brief as the flash of a gunshot. In March of 1942, during a mortar shelling, Leonid was mortally wounded. Lyudmila, casting her rifle aside, carried him, still alive, from the battlefield under a hail of fire. He died in her arms. That day, something inside her soul broke forever. Her grief was quiet, almost invisible to others, but it was forged into a cold, concentrated fury. From then on, every shot she took was not just the completion of a combat mission. It was revenge, a personal, merciless revenge for a love trampled, for a life stolen. Her kill count grew at a terrifying rate. 100, 200, 300. Wehrmacht soldiers passed down legends of Frau Tod, Lady Death, a female phantom who appeared from nowhere and brought doom. A bounty was placed on her head. The best German sniper aces were sent against her, but she emerged victorious from 36 deadly duels, contests of nerves, endurance, and skill. Her official, confirmed count froze at the mark of 309 enemy soldiers and officers. In June of 1942, just a month before the fall of Sevastopol, she herself was severely wounded by a mortar fragment. The command made a decision. Pavlichenko was too valuable to lose. She was evacuated, almost unconscious, from the besieged city by submarine. Her combat career was over. But her second war, the war of a symbol, was just beginning. As soon as she recovered from her wound, she was included in a Soviet delegation sent to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. The goal was to persuade the Allies of the need to open a second front. Thus, Lady Death was transformed into the Kremlin's main propaganda weapon. In America, the land of glossy magazines and Hollywood smiles, her appearance had the effect of an exploding bomb. At press conferences, naive female journalists would ask her, a major in the Red Army with a face scorched by war, why she didn't use makeup or curl her hair. She would look at them with her piercing eyes, which forever held the horror of Sevastopol, and remain silent. But her moment came in Chicago. Taking the stage before a crowd of thousands, she delivered a speech that went down in history. After long, elaborate speeches by American politicians, she said simply, looking directly at the audience, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old. At the front, I have already killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" For a few seconds, the hall was frozen in a deafening silence, and then it erupted in a storm of applause. This fragile woman, with the face of an icon and the record of an elite killer, did more to open a second front than dozens of diplomats. She showed America the real, unvarnished face of war. She became its living, irrefutable proof. In the endless gallery of faces of Soviet women snipers, there is one that is impossible to forget. It looks out at us from yellowed photographs with a disarming tenderness and a kind of childlike, bright sadness. This is the face of Rosa Shanina, a girl from the Arkhangelsk region, with hair the color of ripe rye and eyes that reflected the cold sky of the Russian north. Before the war, she was a kindergarten teacher. Her world was woven from children's laughter, fairy tales, and timid dreams of a great love. But war, like a brutal selector, sees in people not what they are, but what they can become. And in this fragile, poetic soul, it saw the potential of a perfect hunter. Her personal trigger was pulled when, one after another, 3 death notices for her brothers arrived from the front. In an instant, her world, full of light and warmth, collapsed, leaving behind only a scorched emptiness, that only one emotion could fill: revenge. Cold, clear, and all-consuming. Like thousands of others, she knocked on the doors of the recruitment office and eventually got her way. She was sent to the very same Central Women's Sniper School. There, at the Factory of Angels, her natural sharp-sightedness, northern endurance, and steel character were forged into a deadly weapon. She turned out to be a genius at her craft. Her unique signature became duplets, two quick, almost simultaneous shots at two different moving targets. Her hands did not tremble, and her eye never missed. In the spring of 1944, 19-year-old Rosa Shanina arrived at the front, and almost immediately they started talking about her. First in her regiment, then in the division, and soon across the entire front. Her combat score grew rapidly. Soldiers who saw her work nicknamed her the unseen terror of East Prussia. She moved like a shadow, her shots like the bite of an invisible snake, sudden and deadly. But behind this image of a ruthless hunter, behind the crosshairs of her scope, hid a completely different Rosa. And we know about this Rosa only thanks to a small notebook filled with neat handwriting, her frontline diary. This diary is the most shocking and honest document of the era. It is the confession of a soul trapped in hell. On some pages are the dry, businesslike entries of a sniper's logbook. Eliminated 2 Hitlerites. But on the next page, in the same hand, is the cry of a young girl's soul. Why am I here? Why am I killing people? Everything inside me has gone cold. I don't want to kill anymore. I'm so tired. This diary is the battlefield of 2 beings. One is the cold-blooded sniper, carrying out orders. The other is a young girl who describes the beauty of the sunset over the ravaged earth, rejoices at a letter from her mother, and dreams of going to university and falling in love after the war. She wrote about her first kill. Now I understand what it means to kill a person. He fell, so awkwardly, and lay there for a long time, and I just watched and couldn't look away. But then I got used to it. That terrible phrase, "got used to it," was her personal tragedy. Her fame quickly reached the very top. Newspapers printed her portraits. Her name became a symbol. Commanders, understanding the value of such a propaganda asset, tried to protect her by keeping her in the rear. But Rosa was born for battle, not for posing for cameras. She was desperate to get to the front lines. Again and again, disobeying orders, she would run away from headquarters to her battalion, back to the mud and blood of trench life, where she felt she belonged. She wrote in her diary, "I can't sit in the rear. My heart is drawn to where the fate of the motherland is being decided. If I am needed there, I must be there." This rebellious spirit, this refusal to be just a pretty picture on a magazine cover, made her real. Her path was cut short in January of 1945 in East Prussia, just a few months before victory. She was only 20 years old. During a fierce battle, the commander of an artillery unit was severely wounded. Rosa, who was nearby, threw herself over him without hesitation, shielding him with her body from the fragments of an exploding shell. The shrapnel tore through her chest. They found her dying, clutching her submachine gun. The medic who unbuttoned her blood-soaked tunic saw not only the fatal wounds. From her inner pocket, that same notebook fell out, her diary. The last entry, written with a trembling hand, perhaps just hours before her death, was almost illegible. "Perhaps I'll be killed soon. My heart is so heavy. I'm so tired." Rosa Shanina left behind 59 confirmed notches on the stock of her rifle. But her main legacy was not this death toll. Her legacy is her voice, preserved on the pages of her diary. The voice of a young girl who, until her last breath, remained human in inhuman circumstances, who looked into the abyss of war and found the strength to speak of it with piercing, heart-wrenching honesty. Beyond the blinding spotlight that followed legends like Pavlyuchenko, there existed a vast, silent constellation of heroines whose names were whispered in the trenches but rarely shouted from the pages of history. They were the invisible army, the nameless goddesses of war, and among them were figures of such stark contrast and equal brilliance that their stories form a mosaic of Soviet female courage. Two such stars, burning with different light but equal intensity, were Alia Moldagulova and Nina Petrova. If Rosa Shanina was the poet of the Sniper's War, then Alia Moldagulova was its blazing, untamable flame. A 19-year-old Kazakh girl, small and slender, with eyes that held the ancient fire of the steppe. Orphaned early in life, she possessed a fierce, almost feral independence. At the sniper school, instructors noted her quiet determination and the unnerving stillness she could command. But beneath that calm exterior was a spirit forged in hardship, waiting for its moment to erupt. That moment came in the bitter fighting near Pskov in January of 1944. Her battalion's attack faltered under a hail of German machine gun fire. The commander was killed, and for a heart-stopping second, the soldiers faltered, seeking cover, the momentum of the assault broken. It was then that the impossible happened. From a shell crater, a small figure rose. It was Alia. Tossing aside her sniper rifle as if it were a useless stick, she raised a simple automatic and screamed a cry that cut through the din of battle, a cry that came from the very soul of her land. Za Rodinu, Ura! For the motherland, hurrah! And she ran, alone, straight towards the German trenches. For a moment, the soldiers stared, stunned. Then, inspired by her impossible courage, the entire battalion rose as one and followed her. She was the first to leap into the enemy trench, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. She was mortally wounded by a German officer, but even as her life was slipping away, found the strength for one last act of will, firing her weapon and taking him with her. She died a warrior's death, a blazing comet that lit up the battlefield for one glorious, terrifying moment, leading her comrades to victory. If Alia was the fire, then Nina Petrova was the unyielding granite. She was the absolute antithesis of the young girls who filled the sniper schools. When the war began, Nina was already 52 years old. A pre-war physical education instructor from Leningrad, she was a mother and a grandmother. By any normal measure, her place was in the deep rear, far from the fighting. But Nina was not a normal woman. She volunteered for the front, and her age, which should have been a disadvantage, became her greatest weapon. She possessed the infinite patience that only maturity can bring. The soldiers in her unit nicknamed her Mama Nina. She became the matriarch of her regiment, a figure of stern, protective love. She would mend their uniforms, offer a quiet word of encouragement, and then, with the same maternal care, she would pick up her rifle and become one of the most feared snipers on the Leningrad front. Her eyesight was flawless, her hand steady as a rock. While the young girls were driven by fiery revenge, Nina was driven by a cold, protective fury, the fury of a mother defending her home and her children, who were now all the young soldiers around her. Her official count was 122 enemy soldiers and officers. She trained over 500 other snipers right there on the front lines, becoming a living legend. She survived the siege of Leningrad, countless duels with German marksmen, and the bloodiest battles of the war. And then, fate played its cruelest of cosmic jokes. On the 1st of May, 1945, just 1 week before the final victory, the truck she was riding in skidded on a dark road and plunged into a ravine. Mama Nina, the woman who had faced death in the eye 1,000 times and never flinched, was killed in a simple, meaningless traffic accident. The news of her death struck her regiment with the force of a physical blow. The hardened, battle-scarred soldiers who looked up to her as a mother wept without shame. Her war was over, not with a bang, but with a quiet, tragic whisper, a final, brutal lesson in the senselessness of it all. There was trench warfare, with its mud, its cries of hurrah, and the roar of artillery. There was tank warfare, a roaring waltz of fire and steel. But there was another kind of war, a silent, invisible, almost otherworldly war. A war where the battlefield was a patch of scorched earth between two trenches, and the only players were two people, two hunters, frozen in absolute stillness. This was the sniper duel, the quintessence of the craft, its cruelest and purest form. Not a battle, but a chess game, where the price of a single wrong move was life. A silent opera, where the only aria was the whistle of a bullet, and the final chord was silence. It all began with a whisper that swept through the trenches like a cold draft. He's here. This meant that an ace had appeared in the sector, an elite German sniper, sent specifically to sow fear and pick off the command staff. His presence changed the very atmosphere of the front. Soldiers pressed themselves deeper into the earth, stopped peeking out of the trenches, and any carelessness was instantly punished by a precise shot from afar. That's when she would be summoned to headquarters, one of those girls with eyes of steel. The assignment was stated simply, almost mundanely: find and destroy. And she would set off on her own personal war. This was a hunt for an equal, for a predator who was just as smart, just as patient, and just as ruthless. Preparing for the duel was akin to a sacred ritual. Alongside her spotter, she would spend hours, while it was still pitch black, studying no man's land, that tortured, crater-pocked space. They searched for the perfect spot, for a hide, not just a convenient one, but an unpredictable one. The ruins of a chimney, an uprooted tree stump, a pile of burnt planks, any place that didn't catch the eye, that seemed either too obvious or too uncomfortable. Then, under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, they would make their slow, agonizing crawl, literally melting into the landscape. Camouflage wasn't just clothing, it was a second skin. Grass, branches, dirt, everything was used to turn two living people into an inanimate element of the landscape. And once the position was taken, the hardest part began: the wait. It was an art form pushed to the absolute, the art of doing nothing. Hours dragged on like molten lead. Muscles cramped and turned to stone. Insects bit into the skin, but you couldn't even move to brush them away. But the physical torment was nothing compared to the psychological torment. You lie there, and you know, somewhere out there, 200, 300, 500 meters away, he is lying there too. And he is also watching. Each of you is both prey and hunter at the same time. A game of deception began. The spotter would slowly raise a helmet on a stick to draw a shot and pinpoint the position. Or he would hold out a small mirror from behind cover, catching a sunbeam, a classic lure for an inexperienced shooter. But the ace didn't bite. He was playing his own game too. Suddenly, a short, sharp shot would shatter the silence. But the bullet didn't fly toward them. It found its mark in the trench behind them, a careless soldier who had peeked out for a second. It was a message, a cold, cynical message written in blood. I'm here. I see all of you, and I can get any one of you whenever I want. It was an attack on the nerves, a provocation designed to make the sniper boil with rage, make a mistake, try to retaliate immediately, and thus reveal herself. But she was taught not to give in to emotion. She remained as motionless as a statue, only her heart would begin to beat slower and heavier, turning into a cold metronome, counting down the seconds of someone else's life. A day passed, then a second. They lay in the same position, surviving on a few hardtack biscuits, quenching their thirst with a sip of water from a flask. the mind began to play cruel tricks. Every swaying branch seemed like the enemy's movement. Every shadow that shifted under the sun seemed like a camouflaged figure. Paranoia became almost tangible. But it was at that very moment, when their nerves were stretched to the breaking point, when it seemed this standoff would last an eternity, that the enemy would make a mistake. It was almost nothing. A fleeting glint, the sun reflecting off the lens of his scope, lasting less than 1/10 of a second. Or a patch of grass that rustled unnaturally where there was no wind. But the sharp eye of the spotter, who never took his eyes off his binoculars, caught this microscopic movement. A short, silent whisper. "I think I've got him. 250, under the broken wall." Her heart stopped. This was it, the moment all this agony had been for. Her hands, which had seemed numb forever, smoothly, without a single tremor, aimed the heavy rifle. The world narrowed to the small circle in the crosshairs of the scope. There, in that circle, was a barely discernible dot that was her target, her hell, and her deliverance. A slow exhale, a held breath, and a smooth, almost gentle squeeze of the trigger. The shot, not a loud bang, but more of a dry click, a release, and then silence again. The spotter watched through his binoculars, not looking away. And after an endlessly long pause, the exhale she had been waiting for. "He's down. You got him." In that moment, there was no jubilation, only an all-consuming, leaden exhaustion and emptiness. The duel was over. The predator had killed the predator. It was a victory, but one with the bitter aftertaste of respect for a vanquished but worthy foe. Only now could she allow herself to move, to stretch her stiff muscles, and finally, to truly breathe. The silent war on this small patch of earth was over. The world is not yet born. It is a formless, shivering void of gray mist and the smell of cold, damp earth. 2 hours before dawn, two shadows detach themselves from the deeper shadows of the trench. They are a single organism, moving with a silent, practiced synchronicity. One is the sniper, her body burdened by the divine weight of her Mosin Nagant rifle. The other is her spotter, her eyes, ears, and second mind, carrying the powerful trench binoculars and a submachine gun for close quarters emergencies. Their hunt begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, a crawl into the belly of the beast known as no man's land. Their movement is a form of excruciating prayer, not on their knees, but on their stomachs. They are snakes, worms, creatures of the mud. Every inch of ground is earned through a silent agony of burning muscles and scraped skin. A snapped twig sounds like a cannon shot in the stillness. A dislodged pebble is a betrayal. They move for what feels like an eternity, a slow, painful pilgrimage towards a position they scouted days before, a hollowed-out, skeletal ruin of a farmhouse, offering a perfect view of the German line some 600 meters away. Once inside, they become part of the ruin, dissolving into its brokenness. The sniper sets up her rifle, her movements economical and precise. The spotter trains her binoculars on the enemy trench. And then, the true work begins. The wait. The sun rises, a pale, indifferent disk in the hazy sky, revealing the enemy world in merciless detail through the spotter's lenses. It is a world of grim routine. A soldier, face puffy with sleep, smokes a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily in the still air. Another struggles with a piece of machinery. An officer shouts an order, his voice a faint, tinny sound carried on the breeze. For the sniper and her partner, this is a slow, methodical reading of a deadly text. They are not looking for just any target. They are looking for a priority target. An officer, a machine gunner, a communications specialist. The spotter whispers a running commentary, a litany of observations. Two men by the dugout entrance. One is lighting a stovepipe, another carrying ammunition boxes. Wait. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. The sniper remains as still as a statue, her eye occasionally pressed to the scope, conserving energy, her body a coiled spring. She feels the gnawing of hunger, the ache in her back, the maddening itch on her cheek. She ignores it all. She is a machine made of flesh and blood, built for this single purpose. Then, a moment of unexpected, piercing humanity breaks through the cold professionalism. Through the powerful binoculars, the spotter focuses on a young German soldier, no older than 17, who has found a rare moment of peace. He is sitting on an overturned crate, reading a letter, and a faint, sad smile touches his lips. He looks exactly like the sniper's younger brother, the one she left back in Saratov. For a split second, the enemy is no longer a faceless Fritz or a fascist invader. He is a boy, someone's son, someone's brother, smiling at a letter from home. The spotter says nothing, but the sniper, sensing a shift in her partner's stillness, knows. A cold knot tightens in her stomach. This is the part of the job they never taught at the school. The moment is shattered by the spotter's sharp, whispered intake of breath. Target, officer, map case, by the command bunker. The boy with the letter is forgotten. The machine re-engages. The sniper's eye is now fused to the scope. The world disappears, collapsing into the circular frame of the lens. In the center of the crosshairs is a man with officer's tabs on his collar, pointing at a map. He is confident, authoritative, completely unaware that he is the star of a one-act play that is about to end. 600 meters, the spotter whispers. Wind from the left, slight. The sniper's gloved finger curls around the trigger. Her breathing slows, becomes shallow. She exhales half a lungful of air and holds. Time itself seems to stop. There is only the crosshair, the target, and the space between. A slow, steady squeeze. The rifle bucks against her shoulder, a vicious but familiar kick. The sound is sharp, a crack that is instantly swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Long before the sound reaches the target, the small piece of steel has completed its journey. Through the scope, she sees the officer jolt, as if struck by an invisible fist. His map case flies from his hands, and he collapses in a heap. There is no celebration, only a cold, professional assessment. Confirmed hit, the spotter murmurs, her eyes still glued to the binoculars, watching the ensuing chaos in the enemy trench. She sees another soldier, the boy who was reading the letter, rush to the fallen officer's side. His face, which was smiling just moments ago, is now a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. He screams a name, a cry of anguish that they cannot hear but can feel across the distance. He is no longer an enemy soldier. He is a terrified child, watching his world crumble. The sniper sees it too, a fleeting glimpse before she pulls back from the scope, her job done. The hunt is over. They pack up their equipment in silence, the weight of that unheard scream heavier than any rifle. As dusk begins to fall, they will begin their perilous journey back, carrying with them not the thrill of victory, but the chilling, intimate knowledge of the single life they have just extinguished. For the German soldier on the Eastern Front, fear was a constant companion. It was in the primal scream of the Katyusha rockets, the grinding terror of a T-34 tank attack, and the vast, soul-crushing emptiness of the Russian winter. But by 1943, a new and far more insidious fear began to take root. It was a personal, intimate dread, a cancer of the mind that spread through the trenches, not in a thunderous roar, but in a terrified whisper. It was the fear of the invisible enemy, the phantom who dealt death from afar. And what made this fear truly unbearable, what twisted it into a unique form of psychological torment, was the slow dawning realization that this phantom was often a woman. The very concept was an abomination to the Nazi worldview. The German woman's place was defined by the 3 Ks: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. She was the heart of the home, the vessel of the Aryan race. The idea of a woman wielding a rifle, a tool of cold, calculated killing, was not just unnatural, it was monstrous. It shattered their ordered universe. A male sniper was a soldier, a professional engaged in a deadly craft, but a female sniper was a perversion, a creature that had stepped outside the bounds of nature itself. She was a witch. And so the myth of the Flintenweiber, the rifle women, or more contemptuously, the rifle hags, was born. The term itself, dripping with disgust and fear, became a vessel for all their anxieties. Letters home and captured diaries tell a story of creeping paranoia. Soldiers wrote of ghosts in the summer haze, of she-devils who lived in the trees and hunted them for sport. Every unexplained death, every bullet from nowhere, was attributed to the Flintenweiber. They were described as having supernatural sight, as being immune to cold and fear, as being more beast than human. This mythology was not just campfire horror, it was a psychological defense mechanism. It is easier for the psyche to accept being hunted by a monster than by a 19-year-old girl who simply happens to be a better shot. A diary entry from a Corporal Hans Richter, found on his body near Orel, captures this terror perfectly. Another one today. Kurt, he just stood up to stretch, just for a second. The shot came from nowhere. No sound, just a hole appearing in his helmet. We did not see a flash. Nothing. The men are saying it is her again, the one they call the Hex, the witch. They say she never misses. We are not fighting an army anymore. We are fighting ghosts. I find myself watching the trees more than the enemy trench. Every shadow looks like a woman with a rifle. I don't know if I will survive this. God help us. This terror, spreading like a contagion, had a profound effect on morale. It wasn't just the fear of death, but the humiliation of it, being picked off by a woman. The Wehrmacht command, recognizing the danger, reacted with a brutal pragmatism. Official orders were circulated, though often unwritten, that female snipers were not to be taken as prisoners of war. They were to be treated as partisans, which was a death sentence. The hunt for the Flintenweiber became a personal crusade for German marksmen. Killing one was not just eliminating a threat, it was seen as a righteous act, a cleansing of an unnatural blight from the battlefield. This policy had horrific consequences. In one documented instance, a decorated female sniper, her name lost to history, was finally cornered and wounded. As the German soldiers closed in, they saw she was a young woman. For a moment, they hesitated, but the myth was stronger than any fleeting sense of chivalry. "It's a Flintenweib!" one of them shouted. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a cold fury. They did not treat her wounds. They did not take her prisoner. They executed her on the spot, an act of fearful, violent retribution. By creating the myth of the witch, they had given themselves permission to carry out a witch burning. They had to destroy the monster they had themselves imagined, and in doing so, they became monsters themselves. The legend of the Flintenweiber was, in the end, the ultimate testament to the effectiveness of these women. They had done more than just kill soldiers. They had infected the enemy's mind. They had become a weapon of psychological warfare without ever intending to, their very existence a more potent tool of terror than any propaganda leaflet. They were the ghosts in the machine of the German war effort, a chilling folklore written in blood, a dark and powerful tribute from the very men who feared them most. Fame, on the front line, is a poisoned chalice. For the Soviet women snipers, it was a sun that warmed the hearts of their countrymen, but also cast a long, dark shadow from which there was no escape. Every newspaper article celebrating their kill counts, every photograph of a young woman smiling proudly with her rifle was not just a piece of propaganda. It was an intelligence brief for the enemy. It was a death warrant. The German High Command, stung by the mounting losses and the corrosive effect on morale, responded not with blind rage, but with a cold, precise fury. They decided to hunt the hunters. This was not a task for ordinary soldiers. This was a mission for the elite. From the shadowy training grounds of the SS at Zossen and other specialist schools, Germany began to dispatch its own masters of the craft. These were not the conscripts who filled the trenches. They were seasoned veterans, often with experience from other fronts, armed with the superb Mauser Kar 98K rifle fitted with high magnification scopes. They were patient, cunning, and utterly ruthless. Their specific assignment was to counter the growing threat of the Soviet snipers, and in particular, to eliminate the celebrated aces, whose names had become symbols of resistance. The deadly game of cat and mouse had evolved into a duel between titans. On the battlefield, the atmosphere began to change. Soviet sniper pairs would notice a shift in the rhythm of death. The random, opportunistic kills of an average German marksman were replaced by something more sinister. A perfectly placed shot that would kill a spotter, not the sniper, knowing it would leave the shooter blind and vulnerable. Elaborate traps, where a seemingly abandoned piece of equipment was rigged to explode if approached, or, most terrifyingly, the feeling of being studied. A sniper pair would hold a position for days, seeing nothing, only to have a single, expertly aimed bullet slam into the sandbag inches from their head. A calling card, a declaration of war from a professional who was saying, "I see you, I'm just waiting for the perfect moment." For a sniper like Rosa Shanina, whose face was now famous across the front, this meant she was permanently marked. She wrote in her diary of the chilling sensation of being watched not by an army, but by a single, malevolent intelligence. During one tense standoff, her partner was nearly killed by a shot of impossible accuracy. It didn't come from the enemy trench directly opposite, but from an oblique angle, from a position they had considered safe. They realized they weren't just fighting the men in front of them. They were being stalked by a predator moving along the periphery, a ghost who understood their tactics and was using their own methods against them. The hunter was now the prey, and the open fields that were once her hunting grounds had become a cage. The most legendary of these duels were fought by Ludmila Pavlyuchenko during the siege of Sevastopol. Her fame preceded her, and the Germans sent their best to eliminate Lady Death. One of the most famous accounts tells of a multi-day duel with a German sniper ace who had been flown in specifically to kill her. This was not a battle of ammunition, but of willpower. For 3 days, they lay in the ruins, locked in a silent battle of wits and patience. The German was a master of deception, using dummies and complex tricks to try and draw her fire. But Ludmila was his equal in patience. She studied his methods, his rhythm, his arrogance. She noticed his pattern. He would use a decoy, wait, and then, believing he was safe, he would slightly shift his position for a better view. It was a minuscule, almost imperceptible movement. On the 3rd day, after an agonizingly long wait, she saw it, a slight disturbance behind a pile of rubble. It could have been the wind. It could have been a rat. But her instinct, honed by hundreds of hours of hunting, told her otherwise. She did not fire at the movement. She aimed just to the side where she calculated his head would be. She squeezed the trigger. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, she and her spotter made their way to the enemy position. There they found him. In his sniper logbook, they found his own chilling tally. Over 400 Allied soldiers killed on the western and eastern fronts. She had not just killed a soldier, she had defeated a master, an artist of death who was her dark reflection. The victory brought no joy. only a profound, soul-crushing weariness and the cold understanding of the price of her fame. This deadly cycle repeated itself across the front. The most celebrated snipers, the ones whose stories we tell, were the ones who drew the most dangerous opponents. For every hunter they killed, another, more skilled and more determined, would take his place. Many of the great heroines did not survive these duels. Their celebrity, which had made them legends, also made them targets. Fame became their shroud, and the hunt for the hunters took a heavy, brutal toll. The physical wounds of war are plain to see. A missing limb, a puckered scar, a limp that lasts a lifetime. But the deepest wounds are invisible, carved not into the flesh, but into the soul. For the women snipers, this internal war was perhaps more grueling than any duel with a German ace. The job of a sniper is unique in its intimacy. It is not the anonymous, wholesale slaughter of an artillery barrage or the frenzied chaos of a bayonet charge. It is a personal, almost clinical act of execution, repeated dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. And each time, a small piece of the sniper's own humanity is chipped away. During the day, they were soldiers, machines of ice and steel. The mission was everything. The target was just that, a target, a shape in a scope. But at night, in the relative quiet of the dugout, when the adrenaline faded and the exhaustion set in, the ghosts would come. The faces they had only glimpsed through the powerful magnification of their scopes would return in horrifying clarity. The boy reading the letter, the officer smiling just before the bullet struck, the look of surprise on a man's face as his life was extinguished. These were the images that haunted their sleep. Klavdia Kalugina, one of the youngest snipers who went to the front at 17, recalled in a post-war interview, "The first time is the hardest. You see a man, a living person, and you have to kill him. Your hands shake, you sweat, you fire. He falls. And for a long time, you can't get that image out of your head. But then it becomes work. You just count. 1, 2, 10, 50. You stop seeing them as people. You have to. If you let yourself see them as people, you will go mad." This deliberate dehumanization was a necessary shield, a psychological callus built up to protect the mind. But at night, the callus would peel away, and the raw nerves underneath were exposed. One veteran sniper, who remained anonymous after the war, shared a recurring nightmare that plagued her for decades. In the dream, she is back in her lejka, sniper's nest. She looks through her scope and sees a German soldier. She centers the crosshairs. Her finger tightens on the trigger. But when she looks at his face, she sees the face of her own father. She tries to scream, to stop herself, but her finger moves with a will of its own. She fires, and she wakes up, drenched in a cold sweat, the silent scream trapped in her throat. This dream was the ultimate symbol of her internal conflict, the soldier ordered to kill and the daughter who loves. The pressure was immense, a constant grinding weight on the psyche. It manifested in different ways. Some developed a fatalistic gallows humor. Others became withdrawn and silent, their eyes holding a permanent, 1,000-yard stare that looked through people, not at them. The bond between the sniper and her spotter was often the only thing that kept them sane. They were each other's confessors, anchors in a sea of madness. They understood what no one else could, the chilling intimacy of their work and the burden it placed upon them. They would talk about anything and everything, except the faces in the scope. That was the one subject that was too dangerous, the one door they kept locked for fear of what might come out. Rosa Shanina's diary provides the most poignant window into this internal struggle. After one successful hunt, she did not write with pride. She wrote with a chilling philosophical despair. "I keep thinking, What if I met one of them in a different life? What if we were not enemies? Maybe he loved poetry, just like I do. Maybe he had a sweetheart waiting for him. I killed him. But what right did I have? I am filled with a terrible, cold emptiness. Sometimes I think the person I am killing is myself. This was the true price of victory. It wasn't just the risk of being killed, but the certainty of being changed forever. What does a sniper dream of? They dream of silence, of a world without the crack of a rifle. They dream of the faces they have seen, contorted in the final moment of life. They dream of the people they were before they learned to kill, the young girls who loved poetry or dreamed of being teachers. They dream of peace, a peace they fought to win for others, but could rarely find for themselves. The war for them did not end in May of 1945. For many, it would continue for the rest of their lives, a silent, nightly battle against the ghosts they had created. The last shot of the war was fired. The cannons fell silent. A great, shuddering peace settled over the ravaged continent. For the millions of soldiers, this was the moment they had dreamed of, the return home. But for the women snipers, this homecoming was a complex and often painful journey into a new kind of wilderness. They had mastered the art of survival in a world of noise, violence, and constant threat. Now, they had to learn to survive in a world of silence. They returned not as conquering heroines, but as ghosts from a past that society was eager to forget. The same propaganda machine that had built them into legends now fell silent. The nation wanted to heal, to rebuild, to move on. The official narrative shifted back to one of male heroism. The story of the war was to be told through the eyes of the tank commanders, the fighter pilots, and the infantrymen who stormed Berlin. The Flintenweiber, the avenging angels, were an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth in a world that wanted to restore the old order. Women were expected to trade their uniforms for aprons, their rifles for babies, and to quietly resume their natural roles. For many of these women, the transition was brutal. They came back to their villages and cities, but they were no longer the same people who had left. How could you explain the feeling of a rifle's recoil to a mother who only knew the weight of a child? How could you share the memory of lying for 18 hours in a frozen ditch with friends who had spent the war working in a factory? There was an invisible wall between them and the world they had fought to save. They had seen too much, done too much. They spoke a language of survival that no one around them could understand. Many chose the path of silence. They packed away their medals, the Order of the Red Star, the Order of Glory, the Medal for Courage, into dusty boxes. They never spoke of their kill counts. When asked what they did during the war, they would often give a vague, sanitized answer. I was a medic, or I worked as a clerk in a headquarters. It was simpler. It avoided the awkward questions, the looks of shock or disbelief. One sniper recalled trying to tell her new husband about her service. She spoke of a duel with a German ace. He listened, then patted her hand and said, "You have such an imagination. It is better not to think of these terrible things." After that, she never spoke of it again for 50 years. She lived an entire life with her greatest and most terrible secret locked away inside her. The psychological scars, the invisible wounds we spoke of, made a normal life almost impossible for some. The skills that had kept them alive on the front were now liabilities. The hypervigilance, the ability to scan a crowd and instantly identify threats, the instinct to sit with one's back to the wall. These were not qualities that made for a peaceful existence. Loud noises could trigger flashbacks. The sight of a uniform could bring on a cold sweat. Many suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but in those days, it had no name. It was simply called being difficult, or having a bad character. Even the legendary Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko was not immune. After the war, She finished her degree in history, the dream she had before the war. She became a historian, working for the Soviet Navy. She was a living legend, but a deeply wounded one. Her comrades recalled her as being withdrawn, often melancholic. The ghost of Sevastopol never truly left her. She suffered from nightmares, depression, and the lasting effects of her multiple concussions and wounds. The woman who had addressed thousands in Chicago with such fire found it difficult to connect with people on a personal level. She had stared into the abyss of war for so long that its darkness had become a permanent part of her. Lady Death had survived the war, but the peace was a battle of a different kind, one she fought alone, in silence, until her death in 1974. For these women, the war's end was not a liberation, but a new kind of imprisonment. They were trapped between two worlds, the brutal, honest world of the front, where they were respected and essential, and the quiet, dishonest world of peace, where their experiences were an inconvenience. Their final, and perhaps greatest act of courage was to navigate this silent, lonely peace, to build new lives on the foundations of their shattered pasts, and to carry the immense weight of their memories alone. When the final salvos faded, and an overwhelming, unfamiliar silence fell over the ruins of Europe, another war began. A war for memory. The great victory began to be cast in bronze, carved in granite, and written into history books. Marshals, hero tankers, and ace pilots, the undeniable architects of this victory, were raised onto pedestals. Against this majestic backdrop, the faces of women, scorched by war, gradually began to fade, to dissolve, to recede into the background. Their feet, so necessary and so fierce in the days of battle, became uncomfortable, thorny, almost indecent in a world of peace. Their story was split in two. A tiny part was cast in cold bronze, while the vast, living, and terrible remainder was condemned to oblivion. The bronze memory consists of a few names that became official symbols. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, whose trip to America made her a global icon. A few monuments in different cities, a few streets named in their honor. But this official memory, like a skilled sculptor, chiseled away everything superfluous, everything human, from their images. It left us with warriors, but it took away the girls. It preserved the numbers of their deadly counts, but hid the price paid for each of those figures. The bronze statues gazed upon the world with a stern, unblinking stare, but they were silent about the nightmares, the fear, and the unbearable weight of the first kill. This was a sterile, safe version of heroism, convenient for raising future generations, but the majority of them sank into oblivion, and there were many reasons for this. A world weary of blood desperately wanted to return to normal. And in this normal world, a woman's role was that of a mother, a wife, a keeper of the hearth, not an avenging goddess with a rifle on her shoulder. Their experience was too traumatic, their truth too brutal, to fit into the bright myth of victory. Moreover, they themselves became the primary guardians of their own oblivion. They returned from the war and hid the war deep inside themselves. They didn't want to be different, to frighten their neighbors with stories of sniper duels and frozen bodies. They just wanted to live, to love, to raise children, to rejoice in the quiet. And the price of this quiet was silence. Decades later, when new generations who had never known war had grown up, the quiet whisper of these women began to break through the concrete of oblivion. First, in the books of researchers like Svetlana Alexievich, who gave them a voice in her book, The Unwomanly Face of War. The veterans, now gray-haired old women, decided for the first time to speak not of heroic feats, but of feelings. About what German cigarettes smelled like, how terrifying the first time was, and how, after the war, they couldn't look at meat. It reminded them too much of wounds. These simple details, terrifying in their ordinariness, did more to preserve their true memory than all the bronze monuments. The world suddenly saw not poster heroines, but living women who had been through hell and had managed to preserve their souls. Their true legacy is not the numbers in their sniper logbooks or the quantity of their awards. Their legacy is a challenge to our understanding of war, of heroism, and of the strength of the human spirit. They proved that courage has no gender, and the will to defend one's home can turn yesterday's schoolgirl into the most effective of soldiers. Their story is an eternal reminder that war always has many faces, and the most terrible of them are the ones we have refused to see for so long. Their legacy is a piercing, unblinking gaze from old, faded photographs, a gaze that penetrates through the decades, through the thickness of peaceful life, a gaze that asks us, who live in this world, one simple and eternal question: could you? Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.